Would we be able to survive in early America? If we were transported back in time, would we be able to make it? Here on the channel, we focus on the 18th century. We study what they're eating and the people and their lives and how they live. And that challenges us as we live here in modern times. And we say, could we live in those times? They had a very, very difficult life. Death was surrounding them at all times. There were a lot of different challenges that they were up against. Here in early America, you might run into starvation. You might die of thirst. You had problems with exposure. You might get too cold. They also had, of course, violence. You might die in battle or in violent situations. Medicine was so rudimentary that it was probably more dangerous to you than helpful to you. A simple infection might lead to death. Things that we just totally take for granted here in the modern age that we can easily deal with. Sudden death to us is something that is very out of the ordinary. It really catches us off guard. And yet we see many, many references in that 18th century time period, and that will happen to them, and they sort of take it in stride because it's happening so often. Maybe somebody like William Byrd, who's living in the early 18th century down in the Virginia area, and he talks about neighbors of his. He sees them one day, the next day, they're dead. Here's something that we deal with or hear about every day. Say we're in the shoes of someone in Europe in the 18th century and they want to come to North America. Now today, we'd hop on an airplane and we'd fly to Europe back and forth. People do it all the time, and nobody's terribly concerned about dying on an airplane. Yes, we have airplane accidents, but really the number of deaths from airplane accidents is very, very small compared to the number of people traveling. But if you're in Europe and you want to come to North America, you have to travel by ocean in the 18th century. That trip might take 2 months, 3 months, hard to say. And many, many ships are sinking in that time period. It is dangerous to travel back and forth from Europe to North America. In addition to traveling on this fairly fragile vessel, we also have to deal with eating food that might kill us. You might get scurvy or something else. And disease on board ship, very, very dangerous. And not only are you willing to risk the travel, it's very common for people that are new to the New World from Europe to die of disease within the first 6 months. Why would someone take on these kinds of risks? Well, there were so many great opportunities in North America compared to what was going on in Europe. There was no place to grow, there was no place to go up, there was no new career in Europe. But North America was ripe with new things going on. So people were willing to take these kinds of risks. And some people did this travel because they were up against it. They had absolutely no choices. William Morley, in his 1720s memoir, talks about being in Great Britain. He was down on his luck. He was probably in his late teens, early 20s. Someone sees him. He's basically homeless and his clothes are raggedy. And they say, you know what? You should indenture yourself and go to the New World. And that's exactly what he does. He signs away 7 years of his labor so that he can travel to the New World to find anything, any kind of new career. Before the 7 years are up, he is able to return to England and try to reclaim his fortune there. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what the death rate was in the 18th century because they did not keep records the way we do today, but it's likely that the rate per thousand is about twice as much as it is today. So death was a common thing. But truly, in this time period, dying before you were 20 was the very most dangerous thing. Infant death mortality was something like 30% at times in certain places of Great Britain and North America during the 18th century time period. Not always that high, but at times very, very high compared to what it is today. If you got to 20 or 25 years of age, you'll probably live a fairly normal lifespan that we would guess today. You're going to live to be 60, 70, even 80 years old. A great example of this is Joseph Plum Martin. He lives to 89 years old, and yet he endured the most extremes of all these issues. He had to deal with severe problems with not having enough food when he was a soldier, not having enough water. Many times he had to deal with sleeping out in the elements, in the wintertime without even a blanket, just sleeping on the ground. He also had to endure battle. He also had to endure disease while he was in the army. And he was in different kinds of accidents that could easily have killed him. And yet, he lived to 89 years old. Another great example is Nicholas Creswell. He comes from Great Britain to North America in 1774. And he wants to seek his fortune. He wants to find a new life in North America. He endures the travel. He does get ill. He has a doctor see him and the doctor poisons him, almost kills him. To recover from that, he decides he's going to take another sea voyage. He's going to go down to the Caribbean, which of course known for its endemic diseases in the time period. Very dangerous place to go. He survives the trip back up to North America, and then he goes out into the frontier, a very dangerous and violent place to go. No medical care. He's going with very few food supplies. He's going in hostile territory. He gets injured when he's in the backwoods of Kentucky. He can't move for a couple of days. He comes back through more hostile territory and he survives with no problem. He even goes back into the frontier one more time to sell his trade goods, and he survives that without any problem at all, even though he was going through very dangerous situations. Nicholas Creswell writes in 1774, "Confined to my room, sick of the bloody flux, I am in a most miserable condition, so weak I can scarcely get across the room, and afflicted with the most excruciating pain in my bowels. I believe my death is very fast approaching. I am wholly resigned to the will of heaven and submit to my fate without repining." If we were back in time, would we be able to survive all the diseases that they had to deal with in the 18th century? There were endemic and epidemic disease problems in North America in the 18th century. There were places in, especially the southern colonies, that were just ripe with disease. People would just die in certain seasons of the year because there were common things like malaria. And then even in Philadelphia, they had problems with epidemic diseases that would come in, especially through the seaports. And there were times when they would have yellow fever problems, and large quantities of the population would die. And one of the biggest killers, smallpox. In a lot of these cases, the medical industry really didn't have much of an answer for this. They just had to grin and bear it. They watched this, they wanted to know what was happening with this, but they didn't have any real cures for it. Luckily, something like smallpox, they did come up with ways to inoculate people, but even that was very dangerous. This seems like an impossible life with all these difficulties: the disease, the food, the thirst, the exposure, and yet we have the example of something like the Lewis and Clark expedition. 25 men, however many men it was, a 2-year expedition into unexplored, hostile territory. They had to travel by water, then they had to walk over mountains, and they were in just terrible difficulties. One person died on that expedition. One man, he died of appendicitis, basically almost right after they left. He would have died whether he was on the expedition or at home. All these men, all the rest of these men came home alive. So, could we survive in early North America? Well, if we could get through that infant mortality phase, and that was difficult, that was rich and poor alike that had that problem. If we could get to, say, 20 years old, well, I think we had a pretty good chance, especially if we were hardened like they were. Now, they lived in hard times. It was a difficult world to survive in, and so they were trained for that. They didn't really have any choice. Another question to ask is, did they even know they were living in dangerous times? Well, compared to hundreds of years earlier, they probably thought they were living in the best of times. I'm sure they thought they had it easy compared to, say, medieval peasants or people from even earlier times. So obviously none of us are going to have to go back in time and endure the 18th century and try to have to survive. The question is, how do we use that information for us today? And there's a lot to learn from the people in the 18th century. So many of those people did travel across those oceans and endure those difficulties. And so many families did leave the easy life on the coast and go into the frontier. They took on those challenges even though it was difficult. We need to take on the challenges that today gives us. We need to cross those oceans, metaphorically. We need to go into the frontier or whatever that is to build a better future for ourselves and for the people after us.